We're here. Well, my name is João Feres Jr. I'm the chief editor of the State University of Rio de Janeiro publishing house, right, EdUERJ. And I'm here honored to receive as a guest in our program, Professor Cas Mudde, which is the Stanley Wade Shelton UGAF Professor of International Affairs and a distinguished research professor at the University of Georgia, and a professor at the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo. Professor Mudde is, known internationally as an expert on this extreme right and on populism. He has published a number of books and articles over the years, and amongst them, Populism, a very short introduction. And this book we're now publishing in translation called The Far Right Today, which appeared in 2019. Welcome, Professor Mudde.
Thanks for having me.
So I would like to, just to start, for starters, I would like to ask you to give us a short introduction to the book, particularly in this historical narrative that you present on the four phases of the far right. I know that the literature has actually proposed a three-stage narrative, and you add a fourth stage to it. So can you please tell us what those stages are and where are we now?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 1988, the now late German political scientist Klaus von Beimer wrote a very influential article where he distinguished three waves of post-war, what he called right-wing extremism in Western Europe. And so this was just before the fall of communism. And so he focused only on Western Europe. And he said that there was a first wave, which was probably roughly 1945 to 1955, which was a wave of kind of neo-fascism. And the far right was consisted primarily out of remnants of the old fascist movements and regimes. And they lived mostly in the shadows of party politics. Then he saw a second wave that roughly started in 55 until 1980 that he called right-wing populism. And this was a kind of a mixed bag of right-wing opposition, fundamental opposition to mainstream politics. Main example was the Poujadistes in France, which the whole term Poujadisme later became almost like a synonym for populism. And this second wave saw some really strong electoral results and parties getting into parliament, but also these were so-called flash parties. They came and they went within one or two elections. And then he said the third wave started in 1980 roughly, and this was the wave that he called the extreme right, that I generally call the populist radical right. And that was largely linked to unemployment, but more importantly to immigration, and particularly the opposition to mass immigration. And this brought parties like the Front National in France or the Austrian Freedom Party in Austria into parliaments. And the argument was that these were parties that came from the outside and that were kind of attacking the political mainstream and the system. And my argument is that in 2000, roughly, we entered a fourth wave. Now, that fourth wave has still similar parties, what I call the populist radical right, that combine nativism, authoritarianism, and populism. But their relationship to the political mainstream has changed. They are no longer outsiders who are challenging the mainstream. They have become part of the mainstream. And they are now helping define what we see as common sense policies. And so in this fourth wave, the far right is not just some small party on the outside, some nuisance in parliament. No, in the fourth wave, the far right is the key party in various countries, is in power in countries like Brazil or India or Israel. It is one of the major opposition parties in France and in other countries. So it's a major player whose values, whose actors are part of the political mainstream.
Okay, so you would classify Bolsonaro's Brazil as a typical fourth wave type of far right?
Yes, Bolsonaro is typical in many ways, atypical in some ways. So in Latin America in general, nativism, the kind of xenophobic form of nationalism, tends to be less central than in North America, for example, or in Europe. That being said, nativism clearly is part of Bolsonaro's ideology. He's not only made racist statements about non-white Brazilians, but he has also spoken negatively about immigration from Venezuela. But it is not as central as it wasn't as central to Jose Antonio Cast in Chile, for example. The other thing in which Bolsonaro is really different is that he came to power as the nominal leader of a non-far right party, which of course has to do with the specific fact of the role of political parties in Brazil, which are largely just vehicles for personal leaders. But this is very rare. In most cases, far right leaders are the leaders of far right political parties. With Bolsonaro, he tried to found his own party that failed, and now he's the leader of yet another party. That is different, right? So Bolsonaro is, on the one hand, this voice of millions of far right Brazilians, and on the other hand, doesn't have his own party.
Yeah, I was about to say something like that. I mean, I think he had a very problematic relationship with the party system himself. You know, he won the 2018 election using the ticket of a party, that was almost non-existent, very small party, PSL. And then he imploded the party, tried to found his own party, did not succeed, as he said. And now he migrated to the Liberal Party, that was a party that was around already, but it was populated by him and his followers. But is already, I mean, he's already showing problems by, with managing the party itself and party politics in general. I mean, he has a hard time doing that.
Right, just like Trump. And one of the things that we have seen since 2016 is that, first of all, you see a merger of the literature on populism and on the far right, and they are different because traditionally the literature on the far right actually comes kind of out of fascism literature. And of course, in fascism, leaders were very important, but so were political organizations, because fascism was totalitarian, and so it had this party that pretty much just created a state within the state. Whereas populism literature, particularly in Latin America, speaks kind of about this leader, which has no real organization and directly communicates with its people. And because both Trump and Bolsonaro really fit that model, although, of course, Trump became the candidate of one of the two major parties, very different from Bolsonaro, still he was never really a party politician. And much of the media and popular interpretation of the far right today is through the prism of either Trump or Bolsonaro or both. And they are kind of outliers, because Marine Le Pen, to a certain extent in France, is much more of an example of a radical right leader, someone who has lived her or his whole life in a radical right subculture or party, that is far more than the leader, that has an ideology, right? That has a clear agenda, rather than largely the whims of one individual without a clear ideology, but with very strong personal opinions. And this is not to say that Trump or Bolsonaro aren't radical right. They are, right? I mean, but they haven't developed an organization. They haven't developed an ideology.
Do you see that the way you put this question, it sounded to me that you're trying trying to suggest, I might be seeing things, that a certain Weberian, paradox of charisma. I mean, since Trump and Bolsonaro are moved by charisma, they have a hard time adapting to institutions, right? The classical problem of relating to institution. And
Yeah, there's this. So this idea of the charismatic leader has always been very strong in populism literature, right? And to a certain extent also in far right literature, but it's based on the wrong interpretation of what charisma is. Like, and so the popular interpretation of charisma is someone who has specific characteristics that seduce the people. Whereas the Weberian interpretation of charisma is very different. It is the follower that defines who has charisma or not. And charisma is always very cultural, even subcultural. People who are very charismatic to one subgroup of the population are completely uncharismatic to another. So charisma does play a role for Bolsonaro, does play a role for Trump. However, I think it is a small minority of the people who vote for these politicians that are actually captured by the charisma of these politicians. I think what we forget in much of the discussion is that today, much of our voting is anti-voting, and particularly in these type of elections between two camps. Right? You cannot understand Bolsonaro without understanding the PT. Without the PT and all the problems that were linked to its governments, there is no Bolsonaro. So a lot of people who voted for Bolsonaro would have voted for anyone who would have run against the PT candidate. Similarly, the vast majority of people who voted for Trump would have voted for any other Republican, whether far right, populist or not, because they voted against the Democratic Party. So charisma is useful to understand, particularly the people we see in the street, right, who come out to his rallies.
Hardcore followers.
Right, but that is still a minority of the electorate that votes for him.
That's true. And now it seems to me, I do a lot of research, and it seems to me that there is a fair amount of people who are voting to remove Bolsonaro.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is underplayed outside of Brazil, at least, is the role of the establishment in the rise of Bolsonaro. So what we often think about Bolsonaro is the anti-establishment candidate, right? Because populism is anti-establishment. But we shouldn't forget that the vast majority of the media conglomerates that control Brazilian media supported Bolsonaro. And that has changed. It has changed fundamentally in many cases, as has the relationship of, let's say, the establishment, political, cultural, economic, towards Bolsonaro. And that's an important change because, again, the story here of Trump is, it's the downtrodden, like, who have risen up against the elites. But actually it wasn't. In neither case this was the case. Yes, there is part of the electorate that feels downtrodden rather than necessarily is downtrodden. But both Trump and Bolsonaro got a lot of support from the richest part of the electorate, as well as from significant parts of the economic elite.
Yeah, I was about to actually have this segue question to you when you said that the fourth wave is mainstream, because Bolsonaro also has a sort of problematic relation with mainstream. He was indeed supported by large sectors of the elite in 2018. But his relationship with mainstream media, I have a study group who does quantitative analysis of mainstream media coverage of politics. So we do it daily, and the main outlets, the chief outlets, the most popular ones they're against Bolsonaro. They're very critical of Bolsonaro, but they're also paradoxical because their economic agenda is similar to the neoliberal agenda of Bolsonaro. So the coverage is like positive towards Bolsonaro Ministry of the Economy, or it had been for a number of years. Nowadays, not anymore. and very much against Bolsonaro and his histrionic personality and the stuff he says. So they're very critical. So in this sense, he's not very mainstream. He hasn't become mainstream.
Yeah, I think that is correct. I think it also has to do with the fact that both, again, in the case of Trump and of Bolsonaro, because they are not really party men, they came to power in the way that often directly elected presidents come to power, without much support in Congress, right? In where the political establishment is.
Uh-huh.
And as a consequence, they governed by coalition. And so Bolsonaro, particularly in the first years, was depending very much on old establishment politicians from mainstream right-wing parties. And the mainstream media, as well as, let's say, the economic mainstream, kind of believed that these old establishment factors would dominate Bolsonaro because they were smarter. And this is exactly the same mistake that was made with Hitler, without saying that Bolsonaro is like Hitler. But it was exactly the same idea. Like when they made him chancellor, they thought, look, he's just a simple corporal. These like elites will control him. They said exactly the same thing about Trump, right? And so for a very long time, the mainstream media, at least right wing, like here Wall Street Journal, would be supportive of specific ministers because they were just part of the old right wing elite. Right?
Exactly.
But they also increasingly saw that the cost of this neoliberal or pro-market or anti-state kind of economic policy was actually a fundamental undermining of, for example, rule of law, which of course is very important for any type of business. And so you see that at the clearer it became that it was the power was actually with Trump or with Bolsonaro, and they were replacing, particularly Bolsonaro actually compared to Trump, were replacing some of these pillars of the old establishment, the relationship becomes more problematic. And I think that is still, again, what also plays a role is while they might be anti-Bolsonaro and they no longer see Bolsonaro as some powerless fool, but an actual danger, they're still very skeptical about the so-called left, which is the alternative, like the PT in Brazil or the Democratic Party in the US.
Mostly for budget reasons, not for values, not because of values.
No, and that should also be very difficult, particularly if you look at how Lula is positioning himself at the moment. I mean, there's very little radical on it, leaving aside that his administration already very
Not
much
even
accommodated.
before there was. Come on.
Right.
Yeah. And during the 2018 election, they painted a picture of, two radical political forces facing each other, whereas in fact, that's fake news. That's one of the major fake news that were produced during the 2018 elections, as if Haddad represented a far left project for Brazil. I mean, which is a blatant lie.
And that
right?
that helps actually, because that's the interesting thing about, again, both Bolsonaro and Trump, but in certain other countries where it is a one-on-one, you see the same. So the far right has actually embraced this moniker and say, sure, we are radical, right? And so they actually profit from this polarization argument. And we see that here in the US also the whole time. It's all about polarization, but there is no polarization. There's radicalization on the right. Just look at the Democratic Party and Biden. There's nothing radical about it. The same as now with Lula and PT. But if you make it out as polarization, then what you allow is for Bolsonaro or Trump or the GOP to argue that they're fighting socialism, like they're fighting Marxism. It is a fight between the far right and the far left. Well, if it is truly a fight between the far right and the far left, we know what big capital chooses. They choose the same as they chose in the 20s, 30s, which is the far right.
Far right, yeah. That's right. It's a redescription of the ideological spectrum. That's what it is.
Yeah, it's this horseshoe idea, right? And
But Cas,
it's,
yeah, it's
yeah,
a horseshoe idea. That's right. Yeah, the extremes approach. Yeah, the spectrum is not linear, right? It makes
yeah,
this kind of elliptical form. Well, horseshoe is better. But Bolsonaro. That's one of my points in the research we did with Bolsonaristas. I think Bolsonaro did something else too. He actually broke the bone of media of the media oligopoly in Brazil, because before him, like PT suffered a lot in the hands of the mainstream media in Brazil, and PT never managed Lula, Dilma, for 13 years in power, and before that, they never managed to constitute channels of communication with the population, with the electorate, if you want, that were independent from the major companies. So they were always dependent on the major companies, were hostages of major companies,
right.
the outlets like Global. And what Bolsonaro did was to split this game. He actually managed to co-opt Record, which is a media conglomerate that has a television, cable, and stuff, and also a portal, internet portal, and stuff like that, which now captures almost 20% of the audience. And also SBT, that belonged to Silvio Santos. Record belonged to the Universal, the Evangelical Church, and the other one to Silvio Santos, who's also a reactionary media guy. And so we don't have anymore that kind of monolithic, narrative about politics in Brazil that we had during the Lava Jato years, for example.
Sure. I think that's an important point. And again, similarities with the US are stronger than in much of Europe. And in the US, that kind of infrastructure, media infrastructure, really strongly predates Trump. To a certain extent, you see the same. You see the role, of course, of evangelicals that play a major role,
Yeah.
not just in terms of electorate, but in terms of money and in terms of infrastructure, as you said. Like, I mean, just having evangelical pulpits pretty much for your candidate is massive. Like, you don't need media if you speak directly to your flock, which of course is being done, despite the fact that here in the US you can't actually be involved in partisan politics if you're a church, or at least you will lose your tax-free status, right? Churches all the time are very clearly supporting Trump, and more importantly, demonizing the other side. In many other countries, that far-right infrastructure is much smaller, which has a lot to do with just the power of state media, which in many Western countries, West European countries, is very big. And so, sure, we now have an infrastructure of far-right media. Of course, religion plays a much smaller role in much of Europe anyway. But this is mostly fringeal media, right? And it's mostly online. Most people still get their information from state media, from the state news on TV, from state radio. And despite that, this is less than it used to be, right? The situation that you have in Brazil or in the US is still relatively unique, and is clearly also, like, as said, is reflective of the role of evangelicals in particular, as well as conservative Catholics, and the fact, and this kind of holy alliance that they have created over the last decade.
Yeah, I think that, in comparative sense, I mean, the way you put it, it seems to me that it's not only the fact that it's state media, because here in Brazil, it wasn't state, it was global. But global was so monopolistic, was so powerful that it produced the same effect. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
But then that kind of arrangement was broken. It's not like that anymore.
Yeah, and I think it also says something about the weakness of the left, to be honest. And I think, to a large extent, the left has become the victim of its own success. And in the 1970s, 1980s, in many countries, the left was hegemonic in many ways. It had a very strong hold
Not
on
here,
people.
though.
No, maybe not here, not in Brazil, but in Europe, for example,
Oh, yeah.
it had a disproportionate voice in the media. And so the idea was we don't need to build like our own media because we have that
We already
exposure.
have it.
But
It wasn't the
but
case
that
here, though.
exposure, right? And the exposure here in Europe became much less as a consequence of neoliberalism, mostly. Um, and although in name, right, many of these organizations are still center left, and their message allegedly still is, they increasingly have sensationalistic programming where they give a lot of voice to particularly the radical right. Why? Because they create scandal, right? And people tune in for that, not just their own supporters. Like actually, it's us liberals who, for some reason, love to get angry at the far right, and therefore we watch and read everything that Trump or Bolsonaro does or says.
Let me put put this question, since I think you have touched some elements of explaining and causation, because the way I read your presentation of the fourth wave in the book, it seems to me that most of the causes you enumerate there, you identify, are like European, right? So the terrorist attacks are northern from the northern hemisphere. For the terrorist attacks in 2001, September 11th, of course, the recession of 2008. Okay, that was worldwide, but here wasn't so great. And like the refugee crisis was also European mostly. Of course, we had this kind of stuff over here, but as you said, not as strong. But would you be able to say that so the far right in Brazil can be understood as an import, something that what are the domestic causes that we can look at? Yeah, I know you're probably going to say evangelicals, would I agree? I concur entirely. But anyway, the question is, what do you think?
So I think at a higher level of abstraction, my argument is that the rise of the far right was facilitated by a shift from the emphasis on socioeconomics to sociocultural issues in politics. And in Western Europe, or if you want the global north, this was mostly related to identity issues related to security and ethnicity, right? The immigration, terrorism. But it is a broader phenomenon.
Can I interrupt you? So it has to do, in a sense, with the post-materialistic shift that we had starting from the 70s and 80s. That's what he's saying.
Yes, to a certain extent, and if you go back even to Englehart's book,
Yeah, exactly.
he speaks about that. Like post-materialism, identity issues are not only left wing; they can be right wing too.
Yeah.
I think to a large extent the same was the case in Brazil. Although, of course, what also played a major role was just the implosion of the left, as well as authoritarianism, just old school authoritarianism about crime, which wouldn't fall within the post-materialist idea. But if you look particularly at the evangelical mobilization, and if you look particularly at where Bolsonaro is positioning him now, like it is this struggle against so-called gender ideology, which is very much about identity. It's about who we are as what a man is, right? What a woman is, what a family is, but also what a nation is. And so it's Bolsonaro is not primarily about socioeconomics. It's not about neoliberal economics. It's about like social cultures. It's about identity. Who are we Brazilians? And in that sense, like there is a similar shift. But sure, to understand Brazilian elections, you first and foremost look at Brazilian things. Like I don't actually argue that we can understand Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, and Le Pen from exactly the same phenomenon. Yes, they all speak against certain things and for certain other things, but elections are incredibly complex and first and foremost national. Again, you cannot understand Bolsonaro without some very random points, including the fact that Lula was in prison. right? I mean, we can come up with all kind of beautiful theories, but if Lula would have stand in that election, like there was no Bolsonaro, and we would never talk about him again.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. You have mentioned populism, right? And I know that everybody knows that you're an accomplished writer on populism, and you have written a lot of stuff on it. So how do you relate far right and populism? I mean, how do you think these things come together? What are the differences? What can you tell us about it?
So I use the term far right as kind of a container concept for both the extreme right and the radical right. And the extreme right is fundamentally against democracy, against this whole concept of popular sovereignty, majority rule, the idea that people elect their own leaders. And think about fascism in the most pure form, but in a sense, military dictatorship would be an example of that. The radical right accepts that people elect their own leaders, but they have problems with concept of liberal democracy, particularly minority rights, rule of law, separation of power. Now, populism is a fundamental part of the contemporary radical right, not of the extreme right. Most extreme right, most fascists are elitist. They actually believe that the people are kind of dumb, inferior, and that there is one leader or a small group of leaders that is superior, and they should therefore rule. It is, in the contemporary context, the radical right that works with populism, that claims to be the voice of the people. This has not always been the case. Like, there was a radical right in the 70s, 80s that wasn't populist that much. But populism has become, in general, much more popular in a sense, particularly outside of Latin America. Of course, Latin America has 3, if not 4 waves of populism. But this has a bit to do with the changing media structure and changing levels of education as well. Is that just this idea that the people are superior to the elite is something that has much stronger and more widespread support. And the radical right embraces that. So populism is part of the radical right. Populism is both smaller and bigger than the far right, because the far right also includes the extreme right, which is not populist. And populists also include non-radical right populists, like left-wing populists, like Maduro or others. Right? So populism should not be seen as synonymous to the radical right or the far right. But it is an important aspect to understand Bolsonaro, to understand Trump, to understand Le Pen. But to be honest, my argument is, and I'm not sure whether this applies in the same way to Latin American radical right leaders as European ones, but for someone like Marine Le Pen, for someone like the leaders of the FPÖ in Austria and others, nativism is more important than populism. Right? For Trump, nativism is more important than populism. If you want to understand Trump's success, you look at like attitudes towards ethnic minorities, racial minorities. I would not be surprised if that would be different with Bolsonaro. There, probably authoritarianism is more important than nativism, and perhaps even than populism.
Yeah, I tried to show in one chapter I wrote for this book that came out in Germany, as a matter of fact, in English though. It was a project that Bolsonaro actually does not use very much, at least did not use it during his campaign. This idea of the people, he did not invest, his communication in the idea of construing a people and that he would represent. That's amazing. Even nation is not very strong. Of course, he claims to be a nationalist. He uses the Brazilian flag as a symbol, but it's not heavily invested in meaning. because of course when we were talking about that, it's almost unavoidable to face, Laclau's idea of the floating signifier and what's being done, because I think in a sense it has colonized the more recent literature on populism. Even the thin ideology that Kaltwasser, and I think you too, right, has
Mhm.
you have defended this, have appropriated or worked with this idea of a thin ideology. But for me, Bolsonaro, I mean, he not even used the signifier very much. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think he plays with it as Trump plays with it, and this is one of the critiques of people sometimes about populism, is this argument: do they really mean it, or are they just using it, right? And
Yeah.
to a certain extent, this can be said about almost every
But
aspect. I mean,
it seems to me, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but part of it, I think it comes from what Laclau has invested the concept with a certain like revolutionary left-wing thing of bringing the things that were outside of politics into politics, right? Politicizing issues that were not political before. So, and explaining actually left-wing populism as sort of, or populism as a whole, as something that is inextricably linked to democracy, right? I think that's a democratic way of doing politics.
yeah, to be honest, I think Laclau's use or Muffi's use is a bit too broad for me. The understanding that Laclau has of populism is almost of politics.
Yeah.
Almost all politics is populist in his understanding, and so in that sense, I don't think we need populism because we have the term politics. I think Mouffe has a bit of a difference in antagonistic versus agonistic conflict. Um, I think that the point is that it's true that leaders that we consider populist also make a lot of statements that are not populist, and actually even sometimes elitist. The point is that nationalist leaders make non-nationalist statements, and neoliberal leaders make pro-state statements. Right? It's politics. It's not an ideological manifesto. I think, on average, there is a very strong populist tone to Bolsonaro, which has increased while he was in power, because, of course, the split between the old right-wing elite and him, there has been growing conflict in that. And so while he was before against the elite, which was really just the PT, right? Now it also includes Moro and all kind of others that are on the right. He does very clearly symbolize, or try to symbolize and claim to be the voice of the people, of the ordinary Brazilians, right? And rather than saying, I'm floating above you, I am this exceptional one. Interesting, Donald Trump started like that. Donald Trump started with a very elitist campaign, pretty much just all the time saying, I am the only one who can save you. And it was Steve Bannon, pretty much, who made it into a populist campaign. Now, importantly, this was only after Trump won the primary. And so the populism was not important for the primary. He didn't win it that much on the populism. It was very strongly anti-establishment, including anti-Republican Party establishment, but not me being the voice of the people. It was me being the ultimate deal maker who can get us out of this mess. It was only during his campaign for the general election that he became populist. And then when he gave his inauguration speech, which is called like the great carnage speech here in the American carnage speech here in the US, he literally said, I've brought you back into the White House, right? He really went to that level of populism, of being the voice of the people. And in power, he went up and down with it. Right, and this is very normal for almost all leaders that we consider populist. You can find speeches where they will say, "I don't care what the people think. Like, this is best for the country." But I think that doesn't undermine the fact that authoritarianism and populism both have been central to Bolsonaro as a political phenomenon.
Okay. Can I ask you the very last question?
Yes, because actually I have another interview at noon.
Okay, great. So it's very quickly. So, it seems to me that the way you put it, and you give more importance to factors of, cultural factors, or at least you saying that this wave actually was created, but we know that mostly by a cultural shift. But we know there's a bunch of literature that goes around and that tries to connect political events and trends in politics to the overall trends of globalization of political economy, right? How do you respond to that? Because I'm not saying that they're right. Please don't take me. I'm just putting the question. And so, how do you respond to that? To people who try to connect these kinds of political shifts to shifts in the overall dynamics of of the economy, of the international economy.
Sure. And so I actually have in the book some of the big debates about what explains the success of the far right. And one is economic anxiety versus cultural backlash, which is like pretty much this debate. Like, is it about people who feel that socioeconomically they are the losers of globalization, or is this mostly a consequence, a backlash against the change in culture, both terms of immigration, ethnicity, but also in terms of values like secularization, gender equality, LGBTQ rights, whatever it is. And the argument is that for decades now, we have research showing almost without fail that cultural backlash is much more important. If you look at the electorate of more successful radical right parties or politicians, like they draw from a large group, and disproportionately, in case of Bolsonaro and Trump in particular, actually from the better off. Now they can still feel that they lose from globalization, right? I mean, we know that relative deprivation is more powerful than absolute deprivation, but like what it shows is that if you would actually make people richer, you would still have racism, to put it very bluntly, right? That being said, I do believe that that socioeconomic developments and globalization in that sense, for the sake of argument, neoliberalism undermining the quality of jobs, the protection of jobs, the income stagnation, etc., they do play a role. But they only really benefit the radical right if they can translate it in social cultural terms. So what I mean is that if you have Sanders versus Trump, why do the average white worker vote for Trump and the average non-white worker vote for Sanders? Because Sanders says this is the system, right? And Trump says this is because of China and because of immigrants. And so if the radical right translates this economic anxiety to social cultural terms, this is because of the immigrants stealing your jobs, this is because of the lefty elites opening the borders or shifting jobs to China, right? Then they can profit. Without that social cultural translation, economic anxious people are not voting for the radical right, because the radical right has nothing to offer to them.
Yeah. Okay. Cas Mudde, thanks so much for the interview. It was great. This interview is, to actually, it's part of the launching of the book, The Far Right Today, Estrema Direita Hoje, which is published, it was published in 2019. It's being published now in Portuguese translation by EdUERJ, the State University of Rio de Janeiro publisher. I would like to thank you very much, and to say to the audience that next time you promised me you would have a Flamengo jersey on you, not a Corinthians jersey. Or Fluminense.
I didn't say that.
I'm putting words in your mouth, right? At least you didn't say that. No, he said Palmeiras. No, I'm kidding. Okay. Thanks so much, man.